New Line said early on that they wanted a roller coaster of a movie, and that was in the back of my mind constructing it. September '99 I started, a week before the shoot. It was a big unknown, huge unknown. We didn't know whether we were going to have 3 million feet of film, million feet of film. New Zealand films I've done in the past, tops has been like 500,000 feet of film. We're getting avid storage, we're getting 1.5 terabytes of storage set up and 6 avids hooked together. Okay. Just gearing up for the biggest thing any of us have ever seen.
The size of the project was quite amazing. The amount of footage that was turned over through the cutting room was nothing I'd ever seen before.
Normally we'd have a ratio of 12 or 15 to 1, but on this I think we end up about 150 to 1, so that's a lot of film.
Some stages we had like 7 and 8 units out shooting, all producing footage.
How many units have we got? I've lost count. There's one over here, there's one down there, there's one here, 2 cameras. There's another one somewhere. Many, many units make much as work for the editors.
5 million feet was shot, of which we printed 70%, so we'd probably have about 3.5, 4 million feet probably.
We actually took editing equipment out onto location and followed Peter around.
They moved to Methven, Edoras. Peter was going to have a little bit of time for us. We decided we would put everything in a chopper and fly the length of the South Island up over the mountains. We had a chopper ride one morning, fantastic, up the Southern Alps. We came in over the set they'd built for Edoras, and Peter was flying in a chopper alongside, and he did an approach to Edoras. I think he was planning a shot as he sort of choppered in up the valley towards Edoras, a sort of tracking shot into Edoras. And so we landed there, and we were editing in a couple of hours' time. We set it all up and dumped the computers there. We're there for 4 or 5 days, then the cut's done, we're out to Wellington and still waiting for Peter.
On a normal movie, your dailies are usually about 25 minutes long.
Sitting through dailies was, sitting through dailies was great some days and excruciating on others.
Very important to watch the dailies because you do have to know what's being photographed, you have to know whether it's in focus, you have to look at the performance of the actors and start to feel the film coming together and the characters. It's all very important information for you to know as you're going through. But we had a real difficulty on our film because of all the units that we're shooting. And it was obviously vital that I watched what they were shooting too, because I had to know what the other directors were actually doing. Our dailies ended up being usually 3.5 to 4 hours long. I mean, if you can imagine that every day at the end of work we had to sit through screening that was as long as Ben-Hur.
I think the largest amount of film to go through the cutting room in a day was 50,000 feet, which would equate to, I think, roughly 8 hours of dailies or rushes.
Usually Andrew, Leslie and myself were the only ones awake at the end of it, and we slowly, as the 4 hours unrolled, there'd be a chorus of snoring starting to happen. I know that Barry Osborne used to loyally come to dailies every single day, but usually by about halfway through he'd be gently snoring behind us as well.
I went crazy one night. I was sitting there watching it, the horse chase sequence, which has ended up quite a brief scene in movie 1. It's, I think, about a couple of minutes, if that, and there was hours and hours and hours of these horses charging around in circles. And we're sitting there one Friday night. This was about a month into production. Someone had asked, "Oh, how much more of this is there?" And someone up the back said, "Oh, I think there's one more reel," but meaning 10 minutes. Actually, there was another 2 hours of it to go. At the end of that screening session, I was feeling a bit homesick. I went home, rang up the travel agent, booked a ticket back to Sydney, and I just had to go home. It was too many horses.
There were some scenes that he really just wanted to be with me when I cut them. For example, Boromir, when he gets shot, he gets the arrows in him. He said, don't touch that, I'll come and cut that with you. We'll go through the material and we'll pick every moment. And I said, okay, so I put it aside. Time went by. Eventually, it was getting close to the point where we had to have an assembly. I said to myself, well, I won't tell him, I'll just put it together. So I shut myself off for a day or two, put that scene together, and it's as it is in the movie. It's never been changed. Peter never looked at the dailies, we never went back there, so I was quite pleased with that.
After a couple of months of cutting, you get to see a pretty tight version of the film that matches the script. People might think, well, you know, that's the film finished, you know, you've matched the script and that's exactly what you want. But it's not, it never ever is, because at that point, you know, problems with the script start to show themselves, that bits of the film start to drag, that you put things in a script that are repeating the same piece of information twice. It's redundant. You know, things that you shot, you know, with the best intentions, you realise you didn't actually need.
The story had to work for people who didn't know anything about Lord of the Rings. People who had never read the books, had never heard of Frodo. They had to understand the story from the first minute through the end. We had to make the film work for them. Obviously, the people who haven't read the books, they aren't going to miss things that aren't in the film, which were in the books, but whereas the fans were. So there was a kind of a tension between those two things.
Well, it's none of our concern what goes on beyond our borders. Keep your nose out of trouble, and no trouble will come to you.
The first assembly of the film would be 4.5 hours duration, all the material together. That's a tight cut of the film with all the scenes in there.
Peter always worked on the principle of, if you've shot it, it should be cut and it should be going to go into the movie in the first instance. So he wanted to put the whole movie together with everything in it as the first option. And then obviously it was too long. We all looked at that and we thought this is too long. Everyone agreed it was too long. And the next process really was to start figuring out where it's too long and whether there's any elements of the story that aren't clear.
This amount of material, you're conscious of how long an audience will sit there in cinema. And I think this is a special film, but 3.5 hours, 4 hours, it's just not a commercial reality.
The epiphany we had was that film one really needed to be Frodo-centric. And we spent a day together in Peter's house, sort of rebashing out the story, you know, on paper, Frodo-centrically. And when you did that, suddenly you didn't have to argue about the relative merits of individual beloved scenes anymore, because it became immediately self-evident what had to, quote, go.
Any time in the movie it goes away from Frodo, and it's not about him, or about the ring, or about other people's impressions of the ring, then we've got to have a really good reason to have it in the movie. And obviously there's scenes that we have to have, you know, when Gandalf goes to see Saruman, and there is definitely moments where it goes away from Frodo and the ring, but those are completely essential parts of the story as well. So we started to trim away material that wasn't directly related to that Frodo story, and that's really how we arrived at the theatrical cut of the film.
From there on, there were a few more pickups, and it was a process for refining it. At this stage, everything that came out was pretty painful. There's a lot of little things from the book, which even things that set up events in film 2, like Gimli falling in love with Galadriel, the gift giving in Lothlorien when they leave Lothlorien. Iconic moments from the book, I think. They're great scenes. There just wasn't room for them all, so we had to toss some. On any film, it's always the beginning and the end that you really struggle with.
During the process of pickups and sort of revamping film one a bit and re-scripting bits and pieces, they sort of thought, well, what are we going to do about the prologue?
And the prologue, you know, we struggled with it, and it was the last thing we finished. It was originally written to be a 7-minute prologue on the front of the film, telling the backstory of the ring, Sauron, of Isildur, the failed attempt to destroy the ring.
Just because of men, the ring survives.
During the cut, we went away from that idea and we tried to incorporate that material where it was relevant in the story, but we never made it work. It always slowed up the film there, so this was kind of unfinished business and we still hadn't dealt with it.
At the very last minute, after we showed the picture for the last time to the studio, as Peter was leaving for London to score the picture, we were faced with reinstituting the prologue, and it also meant recutting the prologue and adding in some new visual effects. This is in June, very little time to do all this incredible amount of work. However, somehow, as always, the motto was, okay, we all know this is impossible, so let's just get on with it. And that's what we did. And John Gilbert packed up his Avid hard drives, and we set up an Avid in England where Peter was living. So Peter would go scoring during the day and come back and work with John at night to cut the prologue sequence together right up to the very, very end. And Howard would have to be peeking over their shoulder, kind of figuring out the score for this sequence as it was evolving.
Usually on a film, we hit a lock date, there's no more money to continue, there isn't always the will to continue, but in this case, there was always the will to make it better.
There's a lot of risk associated with shooting 3 films at once. There was a lot of pressure to try to make the Fellowship obviously successful.
The cut that you see in the movies is Peter's cut. I mean, Peter didn't, while New Line had a lot of opinions about the cut, there was never any actual interference in the cut. Peter was able to make the cut as he wanted it. A lot of the scenes that were deleted earlier on, maybe a year ago, are going back into the DVD.
So how long have we been in the theatre and we're still not locked?
Well, you made a lot on Monday. Monday? Well, maybe.
But when we pull them up, quite often we look at them and say, hey, you know, this hasn't been subjected to some of the rigour that the rest of the movie went through. So we're going back and we're polishing them, tightening them up, maybe selecting different takes, getting the actors in to do ADR for new takes, rescoring them. It's a big process.
There am I, being an assembly editor on film 3, but in fact my machine's being used by the editor on film 1 to do the DVD. And so what am I going to do? Sit on my butt and do nothing? I don't think so. As
deep and resonant as the theatrical version of The Fellowship of the Ring is, this gives you all kinds of layers, especially strongly as it relates to Aragorn, his whole backstory, you know, his history, you know, what drives him. It's like peeling away layers. If you look at this extended cut, there's like at least 10 more layers of stuff that you're going to see that is just absolutely fascinating.
The wonderful thing about DVDs as a different medium to cinema is that the expectations are totally different, and the expectations of pace are different. And so I really think it's a great opportunity to be able to now restore back into the movie. We're not having them as a separate chapters, we're putting them back into the body of the film. About 30 minutes worth of extra footage that we have great little scenes, and some big scenes too. They're very often character-driven scenes. They have more humour, and they tell you more about a lot of the characters within the film. They give you more information and more background.
And you've so little faith in your own people. Yes, there is weakness, there is frailty, but there is courage also, and honour to be found in men. But you will not see that.
There are great scenes that came out, and you know it's going to be fantastic for the fans that when they're rolling down the DVD and they hit a new scene, they're going to get excited, I think. I'm
really just delighted to be able to finally make these part of an alternate version of the film, and that's really what I regard the extended DVD release as being. It's like an alternate version of the same movie.
It's pretty cool to finish film 1. It really is. You know, doing this extended cut for the DVD is just putting a few things to rest, pulling some scenes out, some beautiful scenes, putting them where people can see them, and then I can go. You know, I've done my business, and I can pass the baton to film 2. You know, and to be quite honest, it was exhausting. I'm pleased to give it to them. But, you know, I suspect it's like giving birth. You know, women do it, and then immediately afterwards they say, I'm never doing this again. But a year or two further on down, you know, it happens again.
Even though the movie was shot on some amazing locations, I wanted to somehow just shift it, nudge it sideways from reality. New Zealand has got all this amazing landscape which we obviously use to maximum effect, but nonetheless it's still New Zealand, it's still a real country, a real landscape, and I wanted just to nudge it slightly into Middle Earth, which is an ancient world of 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, a world of myth and legend. And we had the incredible opportunity, certainly the first time that I've ever been able to do it in my life, of being able to do a digital colour grade.
Well, digital grading is basically taking, once you've filmed a negative and you have a negative image, you then scan it on a machine, on a scanning machine, into a digital format, which means you can now put it on a monitor and you can manipulate the image with a huge variety of tools. You can make it brighter and darker, you can affect the colours, you can affect highlights and shadows, and you can isolate some parts of the image, and you can basically manipulate the image in just about any conceivable way, and then you scan the footage back out onto negative. So what you end up with is that you started with a 35mm negative, then you finish on a 35mm negative, but you've been able to sort of influence the image in between.
We set about figuring out who we could go to do that work, and we bid it out to a number of different places. It's an evolving area. We eventually hit upon someone I worked with on Matrix, Peter Doyle, and Andrew Lesney had worked with on Babe as well. And both Andrew and I felt very comfortable with Peter Doyle. And I knew Peter Doyle throughout Matrix always said to me, we should digitally grade this whole movie.
The push for digital grading was twofold. One is straight up pragmatism. It's multiple cameras across many months of shooting with quite unpredictable weather. And so you would have a situation where it is a dialogue scene and you would be intercutting between 3 or 4 cameras, spread across a period of like 6 months. So digital was a tool that could basically just bring consistency to that, and to help take a little bit of the pressure off being able to shoot without a filter and get another half hour of daylight at the end, knowing that digital can just kind of pull it back in, knowing that it's a handheld shot and the focus just didn't quite get there. The actor just moved the mark slightly different, and it's a fast shoot, and that's the performance that has to be used to just know that we can get in there and just sharpen just that little bit, just all sorts of like little just technical things that just enhance and just help, you know, the process.
We ultimately did about, 70% of the fellowship went through a computer. Not just talking about the special effects shots, I'm talking about just shots of actors, drama shots actually got scanned and put into a computer and manipulated slightly. The elven characters benefited enormously that when we had shots of, for instance, of Galadriel, we were able to make her skin this pearlescent kind of gleam, as if she had some radiance sort of coming from within her.
The idea was to obviously get the look of the film to have this kind of storybook look to it. And this is one of the things that Peter Jackson would always kind of impress upon the post-grader, was that he would literally sit there with watercolors and say, this is what I want it to look like. It was one of Alan Lee's watercolors.
So, for instance, in the scenes in Mordor and the prologue, we wanted to make them feel like they were antique, that they were antiquated. Not sepia-toned or that silent movie kind of look, but something that felt ancient. So we were able to treat the colours in a different way. And then in Hobbiton, we wanted to feel warmth and green. We wanted Hobbiton to feel like, the perfect picture postcard.
So we got the classic reveal of Hobbiton. We didn't set out to do that much to the shot. Even though it's Hobbiton, you would expect that you would actually want to add green, but what we've found to give a really warm kind of feel to it is we in fact take green out. A little bit of magenta tends to permeate in, which then sends some of the greys slightly magenta, as you can just see coming in there. And then what we do is take those magentas and then sort of swing it into a gold world. And as you can see, it starts to put more of a spread into the grass. You can just see the different sort of layers happening there, and gives that kind of the warm feel that is sort of Hobbiton.
The interior of the Prancing Pony Inn, Bree, I wanted the colours there. There was all firelight, big fire, flickering in the pub, and I wanted it to be not a warm yellow, sort of orangey, cosy fire. I wanted it to be a sickly green colour, a sort of urine stained kind of look. So because the hobbits have to feel uncomfortable. This is an ugly pub. It's not a happy place.
What's really great with digital grading is you can take now your digital images, and we literally would just pass these on to the digital grading house. They could then take these sequences now and kind of caress them into the production footage.
When you look at sequences like Rivendell and Lothlorien, you're thinking that, number one, it's likely to be location work, studio work, it's going to be blue screen work, it's going to be effects work, there's going to be miniatures as well. There's going to be quite a variety of different sources sort of landing in at one spot.
That's one of the reasons that when I'm watching some of the sequences now, they just blend so perfectly, because you're actually matching the live action photography and the digital photography. You're bringing them both together. So you're not watching a live action plate, which is maybe color graded one way because a filter was thrown in front of it, and then now here comes your digital image. And so even though they're the same color, they might kind of pop out a bit from each other in the old lab process.
The look for Moria is very distinctive because it is very monochromatic. What we did is we basically made a decision that because we were entering a civilization that was dead, we would literally visually interpret that as saying that we are sucking the life out of the colour palette of the film. Once the entire sequences came together, we would extract colour out of the whole thing, which we did digitally. So when they first go into the mines, we still have the full colour palette, but what we did is we desaturated the colour very heavily so that a lot of the art direction, which is already fairly monochromatic, would virtually go completely black and white. And in many images, the only thing that was left was either we just had a very subtle green cast in some of the shadows, and that the flesh tones were very weak, but they were still there, and the flaming torch.
Each step tends to then trigger some decisions and choices for the next step. So we have two characters, Legolas and Aragorn, but in fact it's sort of Legolas is delivering a line, You could say that it's a slightly busy shot and you've got a kind of reasonably flat background and two characters. So what we would probably in fact do is it would be great to just have a very soft little subtle spotlight just on Legolas so that your attention is really there and not necessarily on Aragorn. What we can do is what we call track. To do that, the first thing we'd want to do is just kind of tell the computer where Legolas is in the shot, and we'll just use his eyes just as a track point. So the computer's just kind of matching where all that move is. So that having done that, we can now just draw just a basic little shape like that and tell the computer to move that where it's just been, or to match the shot. Now we have a situation where we can just say, and I'll just make it extreme, brighten Legolas right up, but it'll just track all the way through. Obviously that's quite extreme, but what that means is that we can be quite subtle about it in that we can just pull a little bit of colour. It's still keeping enough of the fire light happening on Aragorn, but it means that we can now sort of emulate as if he's walking into the light a little bit, in terms of have Legolas a little bit dark at the entrance of the shot so that your attention is really on Aragorn, and as Legolas moves into the shot, sort of have him move into a light, and therefore then shift attention as the line is given.
We must move on. We cannot linger.
The climax of the film, which takes place on Amon Hen, we did a lot of colour treatment of the forests.
Anyone that's filmed in forests knows any forest that has a solid canopy creates quite a sort of staggering, huge contrast range. When sunlight comes through, as distinct from where the shadows are, there's a huge amount of exposure difference. And generally film stock doesn't have that sort of range. So we'd be trying to control the contrast ratio and set what we thought was a median ground to work in.
So if we take, for example, the raw shot, what we decided to do here was to, in fact, what we say, expose for the forest or for the leaves. So if we pull that down, we can see, all this detail come in. Then what we would do is just sort of go in and lift back up the floor just with a basic shape like that, so that we effectively split the shot into two, everything that's bright and everything that's dark, so we can sort of control the two. And then we can start to separate the colours. Now, what we're able to do is just lock onto the green and just swing the green of the leaves and shifting it to a kind of yellow gold. If we then look at the next shot, which is when Viggo is leaning down, we have quite a challenge, which is an incredibly moving moment in this film with Viggo being shot against sky. So what we want to do is balance for Viggo's face and get in and really separate that foreground, which we can do by selecting anything that's bright, for example here, pulling that down and then swinging the green of that around so that it's definitely sort of autumnal and golden hour, and really just play with the exposure. Because we have an interesting discussion, which is certainly something that Peter likes to work on a lot, is do we set it in a way that it's actually just a little bit hard to see what's happening in the eyes, or do we in fact sort of relight the shot a little bit so that you are definitely focused on the eyes in this case, sort of add very minimal little spotlight just on the eyes, just so that you can absolutely focus on the performance.
I do not know what strength is in my blood, but I swear to you I will not let the White City fall.
What's been fantastic on this film is it was definitely a tool that the DOP wanted and then used. What was also responsible, I believe, of production is to include the DOP in the post-production process so that collectively we could, continue to work with his negative and then present to a director. And I think that's definitely the best way of achieving a creative vision.
I really like playing around with the colours because they do affect you subconsciously. Most people won't notice, but they help, just as the performance of the actors or the music helps. It helps create a sort of an emotional mood to what you're seeing.